I have my air conditioning. Oh,
Good evening, Bill.
good evening, Sandi.
You were just having a moan that you have absolutely no idea what we're going to talk about, and yet here's the title right in front of you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm seeing God. I understand that, but I guess we'll see where this leads.
What do you think I mean, or what do you think is meant by seeing God?
I think it's artistic interpretations of the different and varied interpretations of the concept of God in visual art.
Sure.
I can only assume.
Okay. You've seen God a lot, right?
I've seen interpretations of God a lot, if that's what you mean. Personally, I have not seen them, it, him, whatever.
What is God to you, Bill?
I don't want to offend any of our viewers.
Well, as you know, the disclaimer on this show is that you and I should feel able to say what we mean.
Yeah.
With everybody realizing that this is entirely our own opinion. It doesn't mean anything. We're not trying to influence anyone else.
Yeah. I think God is what people hope exists to make their life meaningful and to make sense.
But what is God to you?
I was going to say a waste of time, but I don't know. In my better days, I would say that it is the ultimate concept of good, maybe. You know, in a Greek philosophy kind of way. I think you have a far more everything is vibrating kind of view of this kind of thing, by my guess.
I wonder about it.
Well, you certainly live in a world of more woo philosophy than I do.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Where do you come down on it?
Yes, I do. Like you, I've seen many depictions of God. And also I've seen many depictions of things that are religious, many things that are spiritual,
Sure.
and they do have a connection.
Yeah.
But they're not always the same thing.
Sure.
From my point of view, God is a device, like a cultural device. But really, when I try and take in God, and if I can use words to describe it, it would be something that to me is within of, beside, above, below everything.
Yeah. You don't anthropomorphize God.
Well, I mean, I remember being a child and asking, how did God get to be so old?
Yeah.
Right. And I meant that because in my mind, he was an old man with a white beard. And I remember having that conversation with my grandmother. So I know that I was got at in childhood.
Sure.
About God, as most children are in the West. In the UK, sure. I would say that a lot of my friends would be the same, where they would maybe have assumed that God was an old man.
Sure.
I'm not so sure about children now. I mean, I speak to my own child about this, and she doesn't particularly identify with a religion, but she's very interested in Jesus and the life of Jesus. We've only ever taken her to church for other people's religious ceremonies, like a wedding. She's never been to Sunday school. she has a kind of overview of the Bible from school. It's interesting having a child and having like a pressure on you to explain God, just in case, I've got it wrong. I've always found that kind of amusing in myself, the kind of worry, like I haven't had her christened or baptized.
You do have that worry?
A little bit. But then I haven't been christened. So, I'm properly heathen.
Well, this is your problem all along. We figured it out. We cracked the case.
Well, I mean, I was left by the fairy folk in the forest.
Sure. Yeah.
Can't you see my pointy ears?
It is interesting that if I were to visualize God, I would tend towards, I don't know, the sky in a Turner painting or something would be more of where I would go versus something like this. Yeah. Here we are, early Yahweh, not El, but Yahweh. So, right. So we're talking. Yeah, it's just so interesting. It's like, oh, it's a man with a bird.
Yeah, and a wheel with wings.
Yeah.
A warrior god. That did some cool stuff with Moses. Like.
Yes, and also at the time was not the only god.
Indeed, but then what I find so fascinating about trying to find out a little bit more about the various religions of our world,
sure,
is that I find it so confusing, because I'm told that Judaism, Christianity, they're monotheistic,
and Islam are technically all worshiping the same god. Yeah,
and yet when you kind of scrabble around in the history of it,
yeah,
find that there are many deities and gods.
Especially in early Judaism, it's just like, somehow Yahweh got a promotion, a big promotion.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So this, by the way, this discussion is not in any way to misinform others or to say that religion is wrong, but I find it very confusing.
Well, it's just interesting from a sociological, historical point of view. Take the religion out of it, and it's still fascinating. But go ahead.
It is. But I do ask myself, like you, I've been exposed to thousands of images of God and the religious, and particularly depictions of Christ in the canon of Western art, right? And I think to myself, well, what does God really look like?
Yeah.
For all my woo philosophies on life, the fact is that I have been hammered over the head the whole lifetime of seeing God, and yet I don't believe in God.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't that give you a more objective view of all of this? In the sense that, like, if you were some true believer Catholic and I said, and you made a thing and you're just like, well, Jesus is some white guy with long hair and blue eyes who, whatever, according to all of this stuff from the 17th century or 18th century. Well, obviously we know that's not true, probably. So that you in some ways have a better view of it than maybe people who do believe, is what I'm saying. I'm
not sure that there's anything about better or worse.
Well,
that's a dangerous ground.
A more objective view, I guess, of the reality.
Listen to you trying to align objective with better. That's an interesting aspect.
Well, I do generally align objective with better.
Right. Okay. Yes. But what I suppose I wonder is, does God have a form? And if I'm going to take myself away from religion because I don't understand it and I don't affiliate with a particular religion,
right? You're a heathen, right?
First of all, do I believe in a God? No. Do I have another understanding of the word God? Yes, I think so. And does that in any way come close to describing the thing that, in my human limitation, I want to give form to? And as an artist, for example, do I kind of approach the Godhead when I make work, or?
Well, sure. And how much of your interpretation of the concept of God in art that you were going to make is wholly informed by what came before versus what would have come out of your head if you just sat down with a blank slate and we're going to come up with some visual conception of it.
But I also find it, interesting that it's in the interest of the Catholic Church, obviously, which has had its tentacles across the entirety of, the northern Western world in context of art history.
Sure. For the last 1800 years, yeah.
And, I think there was a period, there have been periods where even in Christianity, the image of Christ has been opposed.
Sure.
I think it was in the Byzantine period, there were two different segments of time in which, the people who were important said, no, we mustn't depict images of God.
Yep. Like many Muslims and Jews do today. So
exactly.
It's like, yeah, sure.
And that then gave rise to things like the hand of God and
Sure.
the voice of God. So there were other means with which the representation of God was still able to affect others and became like an action. But it came out of a kind of visual vernacular for a while. But since its reintroduction, which I think was like within maybe the first century, something like the 800s or something.
First millennia, yeah, sure.
It's just been the dominant kind of icon, or
in fact, the definition of an icon in a lot of ways, right? But also, used by religions as advertising material icon. You know what I mean? Like there's consistency for the sake of consistency.
I know that this predates what we're talking about, but I actually I find it interesting that this is a coin.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
Yahweh's on a coin.
Yeah, God's on money already in the 4th century BC.
Yeah, and there's something about that I find interesting as we kind of come into our current world, is that there's the relationships between what God is and what maybe God ought not to be. It's very confused. God is money. Really?
Yeah. Well, God is authority, I guess.
Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. God's
is that a threat, or is that I'm really bright and your eyes can't handle it?
Isn't it fascinating, though, that for the entire, for example, Renaissance, people who would have been aware of certainly the Bible, scripture, the Old Testament, they were making images of God left, right, and center.
Sure. And I mean, isn't one of the 10 commandments no graven images, no idolatry, no whatever it is? And it's like, man, go to St. Peter's, you're gonna see a lot of idolatry.
So why have people been so compelled to make images of God? Why? Make image of something else. Make image of some other aspect of a story, right? But why try to make visual that thing
that is unrepresentable? Because it's so powerful?
Of course. But in context of it being so powerful to the people who think of it in terms of power,
sure, this
is the message to them from the thing they think is most powerful.
Yeah, sure. It always reminds me of the my father in the Middle Ages section of the Met, that I've said before. It's like, these people sure did like Jesus. And of course, my father was being sarcastic at the time, of course, but room after room after room of nothing but Mary and Jesus and Mary and Jesus and Jesus and Jesus and Mary. And what, room after room, century after century of that's all these people could make for themselves in the Western world. It's pretty crazy. See, this is funny because this almost looks like a children's book to me.
Well, I mean, Blake. Let's not forget, Blake was a bit of a laughingstock in his lifetime.
Sure.
Right? That to me makes sense and context to what you've just said. You know, he wasn't it's not he wasn't supported. I just think he wasn't liked, he wasn't rated. And people thought he was mad. But anyway, God blessing the seventh day, I think this might be a representation of almost like the hours, or indeed the days, that lead to that seventh day, the Sabbath. A blinding point of light, for example. Now, Blake, in so many ways, is now considered to be a pioneer and certainly a visionary. And his poems and his illustrations, his drawings and sketches and paintings do reveal something that kind of fuses obviously the occult with the Christian, which I find really, really interesting. And also, again, as somebody who's, you know, grapples with what religion must mean to others, especially people in my own family, for example, who I love and I want to respect. I find it really hard listening to them talking about their allegiance, adherence, and profound and devout worshipfulness and belief in a Christian God who made the world in 7 days. You know, the creation story to me is a fable.
Yeah, it's Homer, but older. You know, yeah.
Also, can I just say, in Islam,
yeah,
God has no gender, has no race, and really has no interest in like human affairs.
Yeah. Well, somehow still cares whether we worship it. It's always funny. The idea of a omnipotent, all-knowing God, it really gives a crap whether anybody believes in him or not.
Right, but like a translation to that, for example, in Genesis, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but what is really clear and what I do know is that we shall make man in our image. It's not my image.
Plural.
Or it's not gendered, and it's not singular, or is it? You know, there's lots of curiosity about this. What I wonder is, like, does an image make us believe more in God?
Yes, I do believe it does.
Explain that, Bill.
Well, now or in historical terms? I think certainly in historical terms, when there was a lot less literacy, visuals of God were a huge part of transmitting information about religion. I think though, ultimately, we are still primarily visual beings.
Right.
I think trying to explain to somebody, you know, the power of God, and you show them something versus tell them something, people believe things they're shown more than things they're told.
So seeing is believing.
Yeah, I think so.
Isn't it interesting that in the past, people would believe a painting?
Yeah, well, it's the best we had, I guess. Yeah.
Right, but you know, we have issues now with people believing photographs, don't we?
Sure. Well, it's because we've been able to make fake photographs, but yes.
No, but always. Photographs have been a deception in so many ways.
Sure. Of course, but I mean, now the power we have is on another level. You know? The scarier thing is like believing video, for example. That's what's getting scary. But yeah.
I mean, if you saw this,
yeah,
what would this tell you?
Maybe it tells you more about the person who made it than it's directly telling you. You know, if somebody's taking all of that time and energy trying to communicate this idea, then it must be pretty important to them, right?
Wow, okay, right. So all this time and energy to communicate an idea.
Dude, these are cool. Also,
Right.
by the way, look like children's books.
I went on Tuesday morning to see the Hilma af Klint and Piet Mondrian show at Tate Modern.
Okay.
And I've known about Hilma af Klint for quite a while through knowing about the Theosophical Society. And being interested in things like Thought Forms, which is an amazing book by Annie Besant and Leadbeater, who were early adopters within the Theosophical movement. And Hilma af Klint was associated with Madame Blavatsky, who started the Theosophical Society. And there are lots of crossover, lots of convergence at this period in history between people who were kind of occultists, spiritualists.
Wait, are these the people that found Krishnamurti?
Yeah, the Theosoph.
Yeah. Okay, I did some reading. Go ahead. Sorry.
Right. Okay. But anyway, Hilma af Klint for many years was completely, really unknown, and had been sort of kept in the shadows rather. And there's been a rise in interest in her work. I know that there was a really brilliant exhibition, which I didn't see, in Australia, I think 2 or 3 years ago, which started to kind of get that kind of churn of interest. But what she's credited with really is being like the pioneering abstract artist of her generation, although she was essentially silenced because of her affiliation with the occult and with spiritualism. So she was also surrounded by people who became quite powerful, like Steiner, and as I said, the Theosophical Society, who were kind of gaining traction really up until the 20s. But her work is like compelling, like to go and actually see it. I've only ever seen it obviously in book form, but to go and actually be in a gallery space and be a bit irritated, frankly, that though I love Mondrian's work, to have her paired with anybody seemed quite irritating to me at first, because her work is just, there's so much of it. Some of it is vast, kind of 2.5 meters tall. She was, very well connected in Sweden, where she was from, with other women artists at the time who were working also in a similar way. There was a group called The Femme, for example, the Five, including Anna Cassel, who worked in a very similar way. They had to tell something. They were interpreting the voice of the masters, the spirits, and they wanted us to know these things. Now, I find that a curious kind of enterprise, but I have to say, being in the presence of this work, it's not that I felt necessarily that I was being spoken to by spirits, but I became certain that the artist was being spoken to by spirits. I hope that makes sense and it isn't too kind of esoteric. It really was clear to me that this was a person who was being driven to make these images. What they communicate, I don't know.
Do you have a favorite of these 10? Personally, I think there's a couple that work better than the others to me. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Do you know, Bill, I hadn't thought of it like that at all. What was also really interesting, and I would urge anyone who's in London or nearby to London to get to this exhibition. It is one of these exhibitions that comes along and you think possibly a lot of people going to see it will not have heard of this artist before, and they possibly will go to see Mondrian's work.
Sure, I don't think I have heard of her.
But yeah, I would urge people to go and sort of experience it in the same way that I always say to people to go and experience the Seagram murals. There's a kind of you said about vibration earlier in terms of like how I think of things. This is a vibrating world. It's ironically not a dead world, even though a lot of the work that she did, and particularly amongst up to probably 12 or 13 different women who she closely associated with, was done through seances and mediumship and reaching into other worlds. But these are like portal spaces to something that is like profoundly
Well, it
spiritual.
does feel very of the spiritualism era of the late 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, you know, there was a kind of trend, it was fashionable in so many ways to be interested in the occult.
Sure.
I
didn't mean that as to be dismissive of this particular work. I'm just saying it was of a time when that was popular.
It was, but I mean, just look at them, right? This is not about making us feel spooked, although there is something uncanny about them. And this is why it's very
spooky.
Pardon?
They're a little spooky, but okay. Yeah.
Well, I know, but there's something also, you know, I can only show this on a screen and do a poor show of like talking about them, right? I really love this work in a personal way, but more than that, even when I'm not kind of speaking personally, I know that sounds obscure in itself, but this work has a life. And it speaks to me of the thing that actually, if I was to try and pot it or make it visual, this would be it. But also, as I said, you know, I would often say to people, go to Tate Modern and see the Seagram murals, go and sit in the Rothko room, spend time with Rothko paintings, even if you think you hate abstract art and you have nothing to do with, you know, something that is color field painting, you don't even know what that means. I would still say to anybody, go and spend time in that room with those paintings and come out and tell us what has happened to you. Because most people I know, even if they're not artsy fartsy, and even if they're an atheist or an anti-theist, thanks Badger, they tend to really feel something that's not just about a kind of lazy human reaction with a standard emotion, that there's a sense of something other.
I mean, I think you get that from a lot of bigger modern works like this.
This stuff hangs in, this is in the Rothko Chapel.
Yeah.
In Texas. Have you ever been there?
No. Where in Texas is it?
Outside Houston, maybe. But it was designed by Philip Johnson.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many things about this I'd love to talk about in another show, actually. But Philip Johnson, you know, pretty much a well-known.
Did I ever tell you the time I got to hang out in the glass house all alone?
Yeah, you did actually. Yeah.
Okay.
You did. We must have talked about Johnson before, actually, and this relationship, because it's very curious to me that Rothko would retract the Seagram murals from Mies van der Rohe's building.
Sure.
That were meant for the restaurant, right? Because he found out that Philip Johnson was the designer.
Yeah.
Philip Johnson was a notorious and apparent neo-Nazi. Anyway, he was then commissioned to design and build the Rothko Chapel, which for Rothko was about a non-denominational interfaith place of reflection, of sanctuary. You know, it opened exactly a year almost after he took his own life, opened in 1971. And outside at the time was Barnett Newman installation that was in memory of Martin Luther King. You know, it's welcomed people from all over the world, all different faiths or no faith, just a summer of quiet reflection. And these paintings are there. The main room is octagonal. And the reason why I mention it actually is in the Hilma af Klint exhibition, there was a fascinating room called, I think the Ether was the room name. And it had all her notebooks, or many of her notebooks, and lots of like collected paraphernalia that would have been culturally significant at the time and related to, for example, spiritualism and occultism, and stuff about Blavatsky and Steiner and, you know, all these names that people know. And right in the center was a glass case, and it was a mock-up of the design she'd made, where she had designed a temple that was meant to be for the worship of the masters, and to kind of, you know, transcend our human limitations in a worshipful space. And actually, the Rothko chapel is very, very similar to it. Now, hers was much more spiral, but it was fascinating for me to see it, because I speak about the Rothko chapel quite a lot with students, especially A-level 3D students, 3D design students. But I didn't know until I saw the exhibition that she had designed a temple. And so it strikes me that humans are really invested, obviously, in depicting God and the religious, but they're also really determined to make spaces that keep us focused on our awe and worshipfulness. And sometimes, even as someone who doesn't believe in God necessarily, and who would be classed probably as an atheist. Am I an atheist? I'm not sure. Nonetheless, I felt the space is really special.
It's interesting. Sometimes the word God is what trips me and some other people up, where the idea of, if I say it's the concept of nothing and everything simultaneously.
Yeah.
That is something you and I could have a conversation about and have ideas about and visualizations and close our eyes and get lost in. And for some people, that would be a way they would describe their God, you know? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, there's these things where sometimes in the way that we have tried to put these things into words or put these things into images, we're retracting, we're regressing from the idea. You know, it's a multidimensional thing becomes two-dimensional, and a lot gets lost in the process.
Bill, can you explain that in a different way? I'm not sure I understand you.
I would have an easier time understanding the concept of God staring at this triptych than I would staring at the Sistine ceiling.
How much of that is the conditions put upon you by your position in history?
Oh, sure. I'm sure a lot of it is. And my level of education and when I was born and where I was born and et cetera, right? All of that plays into it. But I think that there's when you're even looking at something like this is nothing and everything in some ways, right? So it's like, you know, this is your own conception. This isn't a this is a piece of art that could be argued is meant for you to look at it and get lost inside your own inner space while experiencing it. And that in itself could get you closer to the concept than somebody who is implicitly trying to do that.
Right. Okay. But this is entirely and idiotically speculative. If we were to get in our time machine, we were to actually, first of all, let's get in our transmogrifier and go to the Rothko chapel.
Sure.
Break in, steal the painting.
You and I should do a BBC show and travel around the world to these places. Go ahead.
Only to borrow it. Like, we're not going to harm it.
Right.
Although, you know, disclaimer would be something might happen on our time travels, right? But we were to take it back to Renaissance Florence, and we were to burst into Leonardo da Vinci painting, some like religious painting, or Michelangelo, or anybody, right, painting a religious scene. And we were to put this in front of them and say, tell us what you see. would they say, I see God?
I don't know.
But this is what I wonder. Like, again, we're
Sure.
talking about our limitations and our conditions. And
But in some ways, you know, I mean, they have the same limitations and conditions of their time, right? Their concept of God might be more closely tied with a guy with a white beard than yours and mine might be.
I know that, but what I'm wondering is there an image that transcends
That is universal.
all of that?
Big white blank piece of paper.
Right. Okay. So Robert Ryman's got that nailed.
Yep.
Or Eve Klein, or anyone who's done.
Sure. But I think that the minute you try to pin it down, you lose it.
Well, that's the other question, isn't it? Is when one tries to represent God, can God ever be present?
Well,
or through representation at
sure.
all?
Right. I mean, do you've traveled Europe? You've been in churches that have icons. Oh, this is supposed to be the left front toe bone of John the Baptist or whatever, this kind of stuff. I mean, do you separate those places from those things? Do you have, is there any sense of magic to any of that to you? Or do you really just look at it as a medieval bone in a box that probably got sold to these people by somebody who traveled through town or whatever, whatever the probable story is?
I have been very moved by things I've seen, particularly in Italy.
Yeah. Bernini statues and that kind of thing.
I've marveled at those things.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But at Piazzale Michelangelo, up on the hill where you look down over Florence, there is, I think it's Basilica di San Lorenzo or something. I can't remember, but it's an old monastery. And everybody's down there in Florence looking at David. The replica is actually in Piazzale Michelangelo, actually. But
yep.
There's a lot to be said about off the beaten track worshipful spaces that are imbued with a holiness that sometimes does get a bit dulled by the footfall of thousands and thousands of tourists.
Sure.
And gulping at this as if it is a relic in a museum rather than a living entity. Or there are places that have spirit, whether that spirit is of God or there's some other word symbol relationship with the word spirit that's not of God for some people, I don't know. But up there in that little church, and it's got a cemetery attached to it, which has got the bodies of the recent dead as well, there is a real hallowed quiet that is profound.
And you don't think that that's a learned thing, or just because it's a beautiful place overlooking the city?
Well, no, because there are many more beautiful places. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I could argue that the best temple is just being outside in nature, right?
Is Yosemite Valley or something? Yes. Right. I mean, which are far more impressive to me than St. Peter's is,
Or one could go further though and say that do we have to be awed to see God?
True. Yeah.
And I'm not sure that if that's the case, there is a God. If I have to be wowed, maybe it just means I'm horribly disrespectful. But it seems to me that magic's in the detail. That it's in the smallest thing. It's in nothing.
I think to some people too, magic is in the lives of the people who have been to those places. Magic's in the history too. This has been around for so long. This is where people have worshipped for 2,000 years. Therefore, it has weight to it more than something that was consecrated yesterday?
Yesterday, I went to a funny little museum, the Museum of East Dorset, which is in Wimborne Minster, which is about 7 or 8 miles up the road. And my daughter had been there before on a school trip, and my mum's over visiting from Vancouver, and so we took Granny, and we went to the museum. And it's again, by the way, if anyone's listening, please go to this museum. It is so great. It is full of human stories in a way that is so thoughtful and sensitive. It is commemorative, but it's also celebratory. It's fascinating. It's one of these little gems that, who gives a crap about it? Well, I do. It's amazing. But when we were there, Imogen, who's been before, was like, come and see this, come and see this. And we went to this doorway, and I was like, I think this is staff only, Imogen. And she was like, no, 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 no. They showed our school, they showed our school, they showed our school. And so in we went, and there was a hatch in the wall. She opened it up. And luckily it was behind glass. It was a mummified cat and a mummified mouse. And apparently in, like, I think maybe Tudor times, it's a very, very old house. A custom was developed where you would put either old shoes or kind of embalmed animals in the wall of your house to protect you from illness and evil. And anyway, the house where the museum is has been kind of over centuries, has been renovated, and different parts have been added or taken away. And in one particular iteration, builders discovered the mummified cat. But of course, it would be terribly bad luck to take it away.
So they made a little door for it.
So this little door. I can't remember why I was telling you that. There was some reason in context of what we were talking about.
Well, I was saying the things being old gives it some sort of magic. If that was a mummified cat from 1975, it wouldn't have the same thing as being from the Tudor period, would it?
Well, a mummified cat is a mummified cat is perhaps my point.
Well, as they say, as the old saying goes.
Anyway, Bill, most worshipfully, I say thank you very much. This is totally unanswered.
Now I have a reason to go back to Houston.
Beam me in, would you?
Yeah, I only went there once for a job, but spent the day I had off at the at NASA at the Johnson Space Flight Center, which is that would be my Mecca. So
if you go to the Rothko Chapel before me, I will be raging.
I'm gonna have to go just to piss you off.
Thanks, Bill.
No problem. We'll see you soon, Sandi.